Part 2. The Revelation. Clarity is spiritual. Chapter 4. God is not the author of confusion. There is a point where the conversation about clarity must move beyond strategy and enter something deeper. Until now, we have spoken about clarity in practical terms, how it affects trust, opportunity, influence, and outcomes. But clarity is not only a practical matter. It is not merely a communication technique or a professional advantage. At its core, clarity is spiritual. This is where everything begins to shift. Because once clarity is seen as spiritual, it can no longer be treated as optional. Scripture states this plainly. God is not the author of confusion. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33. This is not just a statement about order in a gathering. It is a revelation about the nature of God Himself. It tells us something fundamental, that confusion does not come from Him. It is not part of His character. It is not how He operates. It is not how He communicates. And if confusion is not from Him, then clarity must reflect Him. To understand this, consider how God reveals Himself. From the beginning, His communication has always been intentional. When He speaks, there is direction. When He gives instruction, there is meaning. When He reveals truth, it is not hidden in confusion. It is expressed in a way that can be received. Even when things are not fully understood immediately, they are not designed to be permanently unclear. There is always a path toward understanding. There is always a way forward. God does not create uncertainty for its own sake. He brings light where there is darkness. He brings understanding where there is ignorance. He brings order where there is chaos. Clarity is consistent with His nature. This is why confusion has such strong consequences. Confusion disrupts alignment. It creates hesitation. It introduces doubt. It makes it difficult for people to move forward with confidence. And because of this, confusion becomes a barrier, not only in practical matters, but in spiritual ones as well. If a person does not understand what is being communicated, they cannot respond properly. If they cannot respond, they cannot act. And if they cannot act, they remain where they are. This is why clarity is necessary for transformation. God does not only want to speak, He wants to be understood. Because understanding is what makes response possible. When you begin to see clarity this way, your approach to communication changes. It is no longer about sounding impressive. It is no longer about appearing knowledgeable. It is no longer about using language that creates distance. Instead, it becomes about removing anything that prevents understanding. Because if your communication creates confusion, it does not reflect the nature of God. This is a serious realization. It means that clarity is not simply a skill to develop. It is a responsibility to uphold. This applies in every area of life. In leadership, if direction is unclear, those who follow will struggle. Not because they are incapable, but because they do not understand what is required. Confusion at the top creates disorder throughout the system. In business, if the message is unclear, the market will not respond. Not because the offering lacks value, but because that value has not been made visible. People cannot engage with what they do not understand. In relationships, If communication is unclear, misunderstanding will grow, and over time, this leads to distance, even when there is no ill intention. And in ministry, the consequences are even more significant. If truth is not communicated clearly, people cannot receive it. And if they cannot receive it, it cannot produce change in their lives. Clarity is not a preference, it is necessary. There is also a tendency to associate complexity with depth, to assume that something is more valuable if it is more difficult to understand. But this is not always true. Depth does not require confusion. In fact, true depth often becomes clearer, not more complicated. It becomes more refined, more focused, more accessible. This is seen in how Jesus communicated. He did not remove depth from his message, but he removed unnecessary complexity. He spoke in ways that people could grasp. He used language that connected with everyday life. He ensured that those who were willing to listen could understand, because the goal was not to impress, the goal was to reveal. If God is not the author of confusion, then confusion must be addressed wherever it is found. It must be identified. It must be reduced. It must be removed, not aggressively, but intentionally. Because clarity requires effort. It requires discipline. It requires the willingness to simplify without losing meaning, to refine without removing truth, to communicate in a way that serves the listener, not just the speaker. This is where many people struggle. It is easier to speak than it is to be understood. It is easier to say more than it is to say what matters. It is easier to remain vague than it is to be precise. But clarity demands precision. There is also a personal dimension to this. Clarity is not only about how you communicate outwardly, it is also about how you understand inwardly. If you are unclear within yourself, your communication will reflect that. If your thinking is disordered, your expression will be disordered. If your purpose is undefined, your message will lack direction. Clarity begins internally before it is expressed externally. This means that pursuing clarity is not only about improving communication, it is about aligning your thinking, your intentions, and your understanding. Because what is unclear within will eventually become unclear without. As within, so without. Hermetic philosophy. This leads to a final reflection. If God is not the author of confusion, then clarity is not something you pursue alone. It is something you align with. You do not create clarity from nothing. You seek it. You refine it. You allow it to shape how you think, how you speak, and how you act. And as you do, your communication begins to change. It becomes simpler. It becomes more direct. It becomes more effective. Not because it has less meaning, but because it has removed what was unnecessary. Take a moment to consider this. Where in your life is there confusion? Where in your communication is there unnecessary complexity? Where might your message be clear to you, but unclear to others? These are important questions. Because clarity is not automatic, it is intentional. And when it is pursued with understanding, it becomes more than a skill. It becomes a reflection of alignment with truth, with purpose, and with the nature of God Himself. Clarity is not just strategic, it is divine.